Watch glitches. I just wanted to talk about Project Mariana today. So, for those of you that don't know, Project Mariana is from the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub, and it was a proof of concept to demonstrate cross border exchange of wholesale CBDCs using automated market makers. So, those of you that have been watching my videos recently will know that I'm researching automated market makers and the use of XRPL among other DLTs, really in the with the notion of creating a capital flux capacitor. That's the running name of what I'm calling it at the moment. But it's really to describe what the changes that could occur by real world tokenization of assets to in conjunction with programmable banking, programmable money, and decentralized finance. But anyway, today I just want to talk about Project Mariana in this particular video because I think it's informative, if nothing else. So I'm just going to start by reading the introduction to, not the executive summary, because that is pretty much a shortened version of the introduction. So, foreign exchange FX is the largest financial market in the world, trading about $7.5 trillion a day. It operates 24 hours a day, 5.5 days a week. In this market, commercial banks, central banks, brokers, asset managers, corporates, and retail investors trade currencies using a range of instruments, including spot, outright forwards, swaps, and options. FX trading generally relies on either direct, bilateral, or indirect brokered relations with dealers. When relations with dealers are brokered, limit order books, LOBs, are typically used to maintain digital logs of existing orders to match buyers and sellers. Settlements usually occur with delays of up to 2 days, and settlement risk remains an issue. Project Mariana looks to the future and envisions a world in which central banks have issued tokenized forms of central bank money and are available to commercial banks and other financial institutions. So-called wholesale central bank digital currencies, wCBDCs. It investigates how wCBDCs originating from different jurisdictions can be traded and settled safely and efficiently. Mariana borrows ideas and concepts from decentralized finance, where crypto assets are traded and settled immediately via so-called automated market makers. AMMs are smart contracts that allow traders to exchange one crypto asset or tokenized assets more generally for another by drawing on a common pool of liquidity. Prices are determined by the specific algorithm, by a pre-specified algorithm. This project examines if this new approach can simplify existing interbank FX processes. It also explores whether this approach can contribute to enhancing cross-border payments through improved transparency and reduced settlement risk. To this end, it tests three main components, in particular, one, a common technical standard for interoperability between wCBDCs. Two, so-called bridges for wCBDC transfers between different networks. And three, an AMM for FX trading and settlement. Mariana extends previous work looking at the feasibility of cross-border and FX transactions using wCBDCs, arrangements, and distributed ledger technology. Okay, so very interesting because essentially they're tackling the largest market in the world at $7.5 trillion worth of transactions on a daily basis. That's the FX market. They've pointed out that there are delays and risks in the existing FX market, and potentially they're exploring the use of distributed ledger technologies and automated market makers and bridges to alleviate those risks, improving efficiency and reducing risk of those transfers, which when you're dealing with the largest market in the world, is going to have a huge effect on everyone. Hopefully, a beneficial effect. Now, just before we go into the architecture, which that's the area that I really want to tackle today. Let's just look at what their objectives were, because it does inform the decisions that they made for the solution design. And we want to be very sympathetic to them in this instance. I'll explain why in a moment. So the primary objective of Project Mariana was to build a proof of concept of a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week wCBDC ecosystem with an interbank FX market based on an AMM. The experiment looks at trading and settlement of spot FX transactions between commercial banks involving hypothetical euro, Singapore dollar, and Swiss franc. These FX transactions can serve multiple purposes, including cross-border payments. A secondary objective was to understand the role of so-called liquidity providers for an AMM. In particular, the project sought to explore how the amount of liquidity available to a pool, as well as how the parameterization, the predefined algorithm, affect market liquidity, i.e. the ease of which the wCBDCs can be traded for one another. These objectives are mapped into corresponding use cases at the center of the experiment discussed below. Use case 1 focus on FX transactions using wCBDCs in an AMM. Use case 2 considers the liquidity provision of commercial banks to facilitate FX transactions. So again, really interestingly, it's not the central banks that are provisioning liquidity, it's the commercial banks, and you'll see that in the architecture here. Now, again, I think there's no reason why central banks couldn't issue liquidity themselves, and I wonder why they wouldn't want to do that. But if anyone can answer that question, that would be really helpful. Let's jump into this though. So essentially what you have in the high-level architecture are domestic platforms, and this is where the central banks sit, and the central banks issue the wCBDCs, the wholesale central bank digital currencies. These are then bridged across to a transnational network, and it's not shown here, but it's shown in the next diagram. This is where the commercial banks exist. Now, there in this section here, we have a three-dimensional AMM. It's three-dimensional because it's got three currencies in it. Now, that's novel to me. My experience of AMMs is that they only have a pair of currencies in there. So I've got to ask the question, why did they choose to make or use a three-dimensional AMM? Because I think it's just a lot more complicated to do that. However, it may be because it's quicker to do this in a proof of concept, maybe. But if someone can answer that question, that would be really helpful. So let's just dive into this. This is a discussion on AMMs, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. Some functional requirements. Again, let's look at this architecture in a little bit more detail here. So domestic platforms, these are regional central banks. So if you look at A, wCBD issuance is carried out by the central bank. It's then bridged using domestic international WDC transfer. So from the domestic to the transnational network, the currency is bridged. Then these are commercial banks here, these symbols. It's the commercial banks that provide the liquidity to the transnational network AMM. Again, my question would be, why wouldn't the central banks just provide the liquidity directly? Both options are not mutually exclusive options. You can have, in the case of an emergency, if the commercial bank network is not operable, then maybe the central bank has its own network that it can, not network, but connectivity to the network. Then the central bank can issue it directly itself. So it's interesting that they've used commercial banks here. Then we have, so there's an FX transaction occurs, which is D. So going back to this scenario, each central bank is issuing wCBDCs. It's then transferring them to the transnational network. This is where the commercial banks then obtain those wCBDCs and provide liquidity to the three-sided AMM. Now, one of these commercial banks wants to carry out an FX trade. In this instance, it's looking like swapping Singapore dollars for Swiss francs. And then E is the payment here. So now that this Singaporean bank has got its Swiss francs, it pays the Swiss bank to, I guess, in some form of cross-border settlement. And then F is the redemption. So here we go. This wCBDC in the form of a Swiss franc can be redeemed for real francs that are held with the central bank. So typically commercial banks have bank accounts with central banks that hold real money, right? In quotes, real money. And this is the entire process depicted here. Now, I think it's a good proof of concept, but was in space. I think it was with Karma the other day. I was discussing this with Karma, and we were both looking at this thinking this is bloody insane. Why would you do it this way? Now, it would be great if someone at the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub would reach out to us and maybe join us on the space to discuss this in more detail. I suspect they did it this way because they have their objectives that they need to demonstrate, which are very simple objectives in terms of, does this technology work? Can we use it at all? The proof of concept wasn't looking at, they left a lot of things out of the scope of the POC, not least, scaling and securing this kind of architecture. But credit to them, they did successfully demonstrate the use of AMMs for cross-border FX, which is very helpful for us as well. Everyone who is actually interested in how cryptocurrencies can be used for cross-border payments and FX. So a few questions around this, which I would love to have answered, and I will reach out to the team to see if they're prepared to answer those questions. Just to recap, it's like, why wouldn't the central bank bridge and provide liquidity to the AMM directly? Is that a possibility? I imagine it is. And then why the use of a three-dimensional AMM? Because this I don't see this scaling, right? If you've got 50 countries with 50 currencies, are you going to have a 50-sided AMM? I don't think so. You would typically have two-sided AMMs, the standard ones that we have, and there'll be lots of them. And then something like the XRP ledger or whatever technology is used to implement the transnational network, that would have pathfinding, auto bridging, all of those kinds of technologies between the AMMs, so that you don't need to have this very complicated starting off at three-sided AMM turning into, I don't know, 180-sided AMM. That's not going to work. So I suggest that must be an artifact of the proof of concept. It's probably a lot quicker and easier just to set this up to meet their goals. So I'll leave it at that for Project Mariana.